The sanctions were supposed to work. The wars were supposed to stabilize regions. The trillion-dollar campaigns were supposed to secure American influence. And China, according to a lot of people in Washington 20 years ago, was eventually supposed to become more politically similar to the West once it got rich enough. None of that really happened. Instead, while the United States spent almost $2 trillion fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China spent the same era buying, financing, and operating ports across the world. Ports. Which sounds painfully boring until you realize something important. Almost everything around you passed through one. Your phone, your coffee, your laptop battery, half the products in a Walmart aisle. Modern civilization runs on shipping containers stacked like Lego bricks on giant steel vessels moving through narrow pieces of water humanity has fought over for centuries. And China understood that earlier than most people did. Today, Chinese companies hold ownership stakes or operational involvement in roughly 96 overseas ports. Some are small, some are massive strategic gateways sitting near the arteries of global trade. Piraeus in Greece, Gwadar in Pakistan, terminals near the Suez Route, facilities stretching across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Europe. That number alone doesn't mean China controls the world. Internet geopolitics loves dramatic conclusions. Reality is more complicated. But something deeper happened here. While America was focused on military dominance after 9/11, Beijing became obsessed with logistical dominance. Different kind of power, less visible, arguably more durable. And honestly, this shift hid in plain sight because infrastructure doesn't create emotional headlines. Fighter jets do. Aircraft carriers do. Wars definitely do. Ports don't. Ports just quietly decide where trade flows. Back in 2013, Xi Jinping officially launched the Belt and Road Initiative. At the time, a lot of Western analysts treated it like oversized development diplomacy. Railways, ports, roads, industrial parks, all wrapped in ambitious speeches about connectivity. But if you zoomed into the details, the pattern looked different. Chinese state-owned firms like Costco Shipping and China Merchants Port Holdings weren't randomly scattering investments around the map. They targeted chokepoints, trade corridors, deep water access points, places where geography compresses global commerce into narrow lanes. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Route, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near Yemen. Look at maritime traffic maps long enough and the world stops resembling countries. It starts resembling circulation. Oil moving here, containers moving there, grain shipments crossing oceans with timing so precise that delays of even 48 hours can disrupt factories thousands of miles away. Globalization made logistics invisible. That invisibility became strategic camouflage. And there's another reason that matters. Modern ports are no longer just giant parking lots for ships. They are data systems. A major terminal can monitor cargo patterns, industrial demand shifts, fuel flows, commodity shortages, shipping insurance pressure, even manufacturing slowdowns before governments publicly acknowledge them. Information leaks through trade movement constantly. So when Chinese firms financed ports, operated terminals, exported logistics software, and integrated shipping systems into broader supply chains, they weren't simply buying infrastructure. They were embedding themselves into the operating layer of globalization itself. Different from empire, not entirely separate from it either. Now, to be fair, critics often oversimplify this story in the opposite direction too. Not every Chinese port project succeeded. Some became financial headaches. Hambantota in Sri Lanka became the famous example after debt problems pushed the government into a 99-year lease agreement with China Merchants Port Holdings. Western media called it debt trap diplomacy. Beijing called it commercial restructuring. Truthfully, parts of both arguments contain something real. But the more interesting question is why China was willing to absorb risky investments in the first place. Because ports generate something beyond profit: leverage. And the United States spent years underestimating how much leverage could come from controlling movement instead of territory. That distinction changes the entire story. America built military bases across the post-9/11 world. China built logistical footholds across the trading world. One strategy consumed extraordinary amounts of money maintaining unstable regions. The other slowly positioned itself near the arteries of global commerce. There's a dry irony buried in all this. Washington spent years debating how to reshape the Middle East. Beijing spent those same years studying shipping routes, industrial throughput, and container traffic. One side fought insurgencies in deserts, the other learned how the modern economy breathes. And I don't think most people, including many policymakers, fully understood the consequences until the global supply chain crisis during COVID exposed how fragile the system really was. Because once ships stopped moving smoothly, the illusion disappeared. In 2021, dozens of cargo ships sat motionless outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Some waited days, some waited weeks. Americans suddenly discovered that the global economy is not powered by stock market charts or motivational speeches about innovation. It's powered by cranes, diesel fuel, warehouse timing, and exhausted logistics workers trying to move steel boxes fast enough to prevent supermarkets from looking post-apocalyptic. China watched that chaos very carefully. Because Beijing had spent years treating infrastructure as national strategy, while much of the West treated it as background maintenance. And the difference showed. Take Piraeus, Greece. Before Chinese investment, the port struggled with inefficiency, debt pressure, and declining competitiveness during Greece's financial crisis. Then, COSCO gradually took operational control beginning in 2009. Container throughput surged over the following decade. Rail connections improved. Shipping times into parts of Central Europe became faster than traditional northern routes through Rotterdam in some cases. That matters more than it sounds. If you can shave even a few days off shipping time for electronics, auto parts, or industrial equipment, companies notice immediately. Logistics margins are brutal. Delays cost millions very quickly. And China understood something many governments ignored for years. Efficiency creates dependency. Not dramatic dependency, quiet dependency. A factory in Germany waiting on components from Asia doesn't care about ideology. It cares whether shipments arrive on time. Retailers don't care who owns terminal equipment if shelves stay stocked. Supply chains reward reliability long before they reward political values. That's why China's rise inside global infrastructure happened so quietly. The system itself welcomed lower costs and faster movement. And honestly, some countries genuinely wanted Chinese investment because Western alternatives either moved too slowly or never appeared at all. That part gets ignored constantly. When governments across Africa, South Asia, or Southern Europe needed ports, railways, roads, or industrial financing, Chinese banks often arrived with actual construction timelines attached. Meanwhile, Western institutions frequently arrived with feasibility studies, procurement negotiations, environmental reviews, governance conditions, and conferences about future cooperation. Sometimes those safeguards are necessary. Sometimes they're painfully slow. China exploited that gap aggressively. Now, this is usually where people bring up debt trap diplomacy. And there are real concerns there. Some Belt and Road projects became economically unsustainable. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port became the most famous example after debt repayment problems led to a 99-year lease agreement with a Chinese state-linked company. But even that story became simplified into propaganda from both sides. The reality is that many countries pursued these projects willingly because infrastructure shortages were immediate and politically urgent. Leaders wanted ports, roads, railways, industrial growth. China offered financing when others hesitated. The bigger issue wasn't just debt, it was integration. Because Beijing wasn't simply funding isolated projects, it was building networks connecting shipping, manufacturing, energy transport, digital systems, and industrial supply chains together. That's the part that changed the game. A port by itself is useful. A port connected to rail corridors, industrial parks, digital customs systems, and Chinese shipping firms becomes something much more powerful, an ecosystem. And ecosystems are hard to replace once businesses adapt around them. There's another layer here that barely got attention until recently: data. Modern ports collect enormous amounts of commercial intelligence. Cargo volumes, commodity movements, industrial demand shifts, fuel patterns, shipping slowdowns, supply shortages. The movement of trade reveals the health of economies almost in real time. In some cases, Chinese firms didn't just finance terminals. They supplied the cranes, logistics software, automation systems, and maintenance infrastructure too. That's not colonialism in the old sense. It's systemic positioning. And the United States reacted surprisingly late. For years after 9/11, Washington's strategic attention remained overwhelmingly focused on counterterrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, drone campaigns, insurgency doctrine. Meanwhile, China's leadership kept studying industrial capacity, maritime access, shipbuilding, rare earth processing, and manufacturing scale. Different priorities create different futures. There's a darkly funny line hidden inside this entire era. America fought the war on terror. China fought the war for supply chains. Only one of those generated container dominance. And to be fair, the United States still possesses extraordinary advantages. The dollar remains central to global finance. American universities dominate elite research. U.S. naval power is unmatched overall. Silicon Valley still shapes the digital economy in ways China cannot fully replicate. This is not a clean, China wins, America loses story. But it is a story about strategic focus. Because while Washington spent trillions managing instability overseas, Beijing spent decades embedding itself into the physical systems carrying global commerce. And eventually, even the Pentagon started noticing. Buried inside recent U.S. defense and logistics assessments is growing concern about maritime dependency, shipbuilding decline, and supply chain vulnerability. Not panic, not cinematic collapse language, just quiet recognition that the country which designed much of the post-1945 global system may no longer understand its operational plumbing better than its primary rival does. That realization changes policy fast, which is why the next phase of this story becomes far more dangerous than the first. There's a statistic that should probably receive more attention than most missile tests. China now builds more commercial ships than the rest of the world combined. The United States builds very few by comparison. And that doesn't automatically mean military defeat or imperial collapse or any of the dramatic language people throw around online. But it does reveal where industrial attention went over the last 20 years. America optimized for financial power and military projection. China optimized for industrial depth and logistical control. Those priorities shape everything downstream. Because ports were never the full story. Ports only matter if you also control shipping capacity, container production, rail integration, industrial output, and the manufacturing ecosystems feeding the entire machine. China increasingly does. At one point, Chinese companies produced roughly 95% of the world's shipping containers. Again, one of those numbers that sounds exaggerated until you verify it repeatedly. Think about how strange that is. The global economy depends on millions of steel containers quietly moving across oceans every day. And one country dominates the production of the boxes themselves. That's not symbolic influence. That's infrastructural gravity. And here's where the story becomes more complicated than China planned everything perfectly. Because Beijing also made mistakes. Serious ones. Local government debt exploded during the infrastructure boom. Some Belt and Road projects failed commercially. Property developers collapsed under massive leverage. Demographics are turning against long-term growth. Foreign investors became more cautious after crackdowns on private firms and rising geopolitical tensions. China has vulnerabilities everywhere. But the reversal that shocked many Western policymakers is this. Globalization did not weaken Chinese state capacity the way many expected. It strengthened it. That was the original assumption back in the early 2000s. Integrate China deeply enough into global trade, allow market expansion, increase foreign investment, and eventually political liberalization would follow naturally. Instead, Beijing used globalization almost like an industrial upgrade program. Manufacturing scale expanded, infrastructure expanded, technical expertise expanded, strategic coordination expanded. Meanwhile, many Western economies gradually hollowed out parts of their industrial base because outsourcing was cheaper and shareholders loved efficiency gains. Until efficiency started looking dangerous. COVID changed the psychological mood around globalization almost overnight. Semiconductor shortages disrupted car manufacturing. Medical supply chains failed. Shipping costs surged. Countries realized they could not easily produce critical goods domestically anymore. Suddenly, terms like friendshoring, reshoring, and supply chain resilience appeared everywhere, which is really another way of saying, we may have optimized ourselves into dependency, and dependency feels fine until relations deteriorate. That's why Washington's posture changed so dramatically after 2018. Tariffs under Trump, semiconductor restrictions under Biden. The CHIPS and Science Act pouring billions into domestic manufacturing incentives. Export controls targeting advanced AI chips and lithography systems. Different presidents. Same underlying fear. The United States realized too late that supply chains are not separate from geopolitics. They are geopolitics now. And honestly, China probably understood that earlier because it never fully believed the global system was neutral in the first place. That distinction matters. American policymakers often viewed globalization as an economic framework supported by markets and institutions. Chinese leadership viewed it more like terrain, something to navigate carefully while accumulating industrial leverage before strategic competition intensified, which, from Beijing's perspective, is exactly what happened. There's also a human contradiction underneath all this that doesn't fit neatly into ideological narratives. Millions of ordinary people benefited from globalization. Cheap electronics, affordable goods, faster development across parts of Asia, expanding middle classes, massive reductions in poverty in China itself. At the same time, entire industrial regions in the United States and Europe experienced deindustrialization, wage pressure, and economic decline tied partly to offshoring. Both realities exist together. That's why this debate became politically explosive, because globalization created enormous wealth while distributing pain unevenly. And once tensions between the US and China intensified, countries everywhere started realizing how exposed they were to the systems both powers helped build together. A factory in Mexico depends on Chinese components. European industry depends on maritime stability. American tech firms depend on Asian manufacturing networks. China depends heavily on imported energy moving through vulnerable sea lanes. Everyone is connected. Nobody feels secure. That's the paradox sitting underneath the modern world economy. And this is where I think people misunderstand the real significance of China's ports. The ports themselves are not the final objective. They are access points into the movement system of the global economy. Energy, trade, manufacturing, information, and timing. Whoever understands those flows best gains enormous strategic awareness during crises. Not absolute control, awareness. And awareness becomes power surprisingly fast when supply chains start breaking. Because once nations realize economic infrastructure can be weaponized through sanctions, export restrictions, shipping pressure, technology bans, or financial systems, trust erodes quickly. The world becomes less global almost by accident, which raises an uncomfortable question heading into the next decade. What happens when two superpowers finally realize they were preparing for entirely different versions of power all along? Back in the opening, I said the wars were supposed to work. That line matters more now than it did 20 minutes ago. Because this story is not really about whether China won and America lost. History is rarely that clean. The United States still has unmatched military reach, the world's reserve currency, elite research universities, enormous energy capacity, and alliance networks China cannot easily replicate. But something undeniably shifted during the post-9/11 era. America spent 2 decades trying to stabilize regions through military force. China spent those same decades trying to position itself inside the systems moving global commerce. One strategy burned money maintaining pressure. The other accumulated leverage quietly. And I think that's why this topic suddenly feels bigger than ports. The modern world runs on invisible coordination. Shipping routes, energy corridors, semiconductor supply chains, undersea cables, rare earth processing, warehouse timing, insurance markets, industrial software. The countries shaping those systems shape the future economy almost automatically. That's why infrastructure stopped being boring. A single blockage in the Suez Canal in 2021 briefly disrupted nearly $10 billion in trade per day after the Ever Given container ship became stuck sideways. One ship, one mistake. Global supply chains immediately felt pressure. That moment exposed something uncomfortable. The world economy is much more fragile than most governments publicly admit, and China had already spent years positioning itself near many of the arteries keeping that economy alive. Not secretly controlling them, not orchestrating some cinematic conspiracy, just present, integrated, embedded, which may actually be more effective. There's also a philosophical shift happening beneath all this. For decades, many Western economies moved toward abstraction. Finance, software, digital services, intellectual property, speculative capital. Physical infrastructure often became secondary because it seemed low margin and politically unexciting. China moved differently. Ports, railways, industrial zones, shipyards, power grids, manufacturing ecosystems. One country mastered the software layer of globalization, the other kept building the hardware underneath it. And eventually the hardware started mattering again. That realization is already reshaping policy everywhere. The United States is subsidizing semiconductor manufacturing through the CHIPS Act. Europe is scrambling to reduce strategic dependency. India is trying to position itself as an alternative manufacturing hub. Gulf states are investing aggressively into logistics corridors connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. The age of frictionless globalization is fading. Countries no longer assume economic interdependence automatically creates political stability. In fact, many governments now believe dependence itself creates vulnerability. That changes the logic of the entire system. My own view is this: China's port network alone will not decide the century. Geography still constrains Beijing. Debt pressures are real. Demographics matter. Political rigidity can become dangerous during economic slowdowns. But China identified a truth earlier than much of the West did. In the 21st century, controlling movement may matter more than controlling territory. Movement of goods, movement of energy, movement of industrial capacity, movement of information. And ports sit at the center of all of it. The strange part is that most people still imagine power through images from the 20th century. Tanks crossing borders, aircraft carriers, invasions, military alliances. Those still matter, but systems matter too. Sometimes more. Because a delayed semiconductor shipment can damage economies without firing a missile. A disrupted shipping corridor can create inflation thousands of miles away. A shortage of industrial components can freeze factories faster than political speeches can solve the problem. Modern power looks quieter than people expect, which is probably why so many missed it while it was happening. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The biggest geopolitical shifts often arrive disguised as infrastructure projects nobody wants to talk about on television, until suddenly everybody has to. If you want more videos like this, the hidden systems underneath global power, trade, technology, and strategy, subscribe and stick around. The next decade is going to make boring infrastructure one of the most important stories on Earth.